Boston stretches along the Charles River like a living museum of American history, where cobblestone streets remember the footsteps of revolutionaries and modern skyscrapers cast shadows over centuries-old graveyards. This city of neighborhoods, where Italian fishermen from the North End share the harbor with Brahmin bankers from Beacon Hill, has always been defined by its pursuit of knowledge and learning. Home to Harvard, MIT, Boston University, and dozens of other institutions, Boston breathes academia the way other cities breathe commerce or industry. But even this cradle of American higher education, with all its accumulated wisdom and scholarly tradition, had never witnessed anything quite like what happened in the spring of 2017, when Harvard senior Sarah Elizabeth Chen vanished without a trace just 3 weeks before graduation. 7 years later, the discovery of her completed doctoral-level thesis in a storage locker in South Boston would unravel a mystery so profound that it would challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of consciousness, parallel realities, and the thin boundaries between theoretical physics and lived experience. Sarah Chen was the kind of student that professors remember long after retirement, a brilliant 22-year-old double major in theoretical physics and comparative literature, who seemed to exist at the intersection of science and art with an intensity that both inspired and slightly unnerved those around her. Born to a Taiwanese-American surgeon father and an Irish-American poet mother, Sarah had inherited both the analytical precision of her father's medical training and the imaginative depth of her mother's literary sensibility. At Harvard, she was known for asking questions that made physics professors pause to reconsider fundamental assumptions and for writing literary analyses that revealed hidden mathematical patterns in canonical texts. Sarah's undergraduate thesis project was already legendary among both the physics and literature departments at Harvard. She was working on what she called narrative quantum mechanics, a theoretical framework that proposed stories and consciousness itself might operate according to quantum principles with multiple potential realities existing simultaneously until the act of observation or interpretation collapsed them into a single experienced narrative. Her advisors, Dr. Marcus Weinstein from the physics department and Professor Eleanor Hartwell from comparative literature, initially worried that the project was too ambitious and interdisciplinary for an undergraduate thesis, but Sarah's preliminary research had produced insights so original that both departments were competing to claim her as a graduate student. Those who knew Sarah described her as someone who lived in multiple worlds simultaneously. She could spend hours deriving equations that described the mathematical properties of consciousness, then switch seamlessly to writing poetry that captured the emotional experience of quantum uncertainty. Her dormitory room in Lowell House was a unique space that perfectly reflected her dual nature. One wall covered with whiteboards full of complex physics equations, the opposite wall lined with overflowing bookshelves containing everything from ancient Greek philosophy to contemporary experimental fiction, and scattered throughout, notebooks filled with her own writing that seamlessly blended scientific observation with lyrical reflection. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Sarah had become increasingly absorbed in what she called consciousness archaeology, the idea that human consciousness might be capable of accessing memories or experiences from parallel versions of reality. She spent long hours in Harvard's physics laboratories, using sophisticated equipment to measure electromagnetic fields around people while they were engaged in various forms of creative thinking. Simultaneously, she was conducting experiments in the literature department, where participants would read specific texts, while their brainwave patterns were monitored, looking for evidence that the act of reading fiction might actually allow consciousness to access alternate narrative realities. Sarah's roommate, Jennifer Walsh, a pre-med student from California, later recalled that Sarah had become obsessed with what she called reality bleeding, moments when she claimed to experience memories or knowledge that didn't belong to her actual life history. Sarah would describe dreams in which she lived in versions of Boston, where historical events had unfolded differently, where Harvard had been founded by different people for different purposes, or where the very laws of physics operated under slightly altered principles. Initially, Jennifer dismissed these as the stress-induced fantasies of an overworked genius, but as Sarah's experiences became more frequent and detailed, Jennifer began to worry about her roommate's mental health. Dr. Weinstein and Professor Hartwell were both aware that Sarah's research was pushing into territory that traditional academia considered problematic, but her methodology was rigorous, and her preliminary results were impossible to ignore. Sarah had documented dozens of cases where individuals experiencing what she termed narrative flow states, deep immersion in reading or creative work, showed brain activity patterns that suggested their consciousness was somehow accessing information that shouldn't have been available to them. Most remarkably, several participants in her studies had produced creative work that contained historically accurate details about events they had never studied, or had solved mathematical problems using techniques they had never learned. On May 8, 2017, Sarah left her dormitory room at approximately 2 p.m., telling Jennifer she was going to Widener Library to finalize her thesis research before the defense scheduled for the following week. She carried with her the same leather messenger bag she had used throughout college, containing her laptop, several notebooks, and what Jennifer described as a special book, a volume Sarah had discovered in Harvard's rare book collection that she claimed had unusual properties related to her consciousness research. Jennifer noted that Sarah seemed unusually excited but also apprehensive, as if she were preparing for something momentous, but potentially dangerous. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah came from Dr. Patricia Kim, a librarian in Widener's Special Collections Department, who remembered Sarah requesting access to a particular section of the archives that contained early manuscripts related to consciousness studies and experimental psychology. Dr. Kim recalled that Sarah seemed intensely focused as she studied a collection of documents that had been donated to Harvard in the 1940s by researchers who had been investigating what they called dimensional consciousness, the theory that human awareness might be capable of accessing multiple layers of reality simultaneously. At 6 p.m., when Widener Library closed for the evening, Sarah was nowhere to be found, though her materials were still arranged at her usual study carrel in the rare books reading room. The security guard who locked up that night assumed she had left through another exit, taking her belongings with her. It wasn't until Jennifer reported Sarah missing the next morning that anyone realized something was wrong. The subsequent search revealed that Sarah's laptop and notebooks were still in the library, but she herself had vanished completely. The investigation that followed involved the Harvard University Police Department, the Cambridge Police, the Massachusetts State Police, and eventually the FBI. Sarah's disappearance generated national media attention, partly because of her exceptional academic record, and partly because of the complete absence of any logical explanation for what had happened to her. Security cameras throughout Widener Library showed Sarah entering the building, but never showed her leaving. More puzzling still, the cameras in the rare books reading room had experienced what library technicians described as systematic electronic interference for approximately 4 hours that afternoon, exactly the period when Sarah had been working there. The search for Sarah mobilized hundreds of volunteers and professional search teams who combed through every building on Harvard's campus, searched the banks of the Charles River, and investigated every possible lead that emerged from the extensive media coverage. Sarah's parents, Dr. David Chen and Professor Mary O'Brien Chen, offered a substantial reward for information leading to their daughter's safe return and hired private investigators to supplement the official search efforts. Despite these unprecedented efforts, no trace of Sarah was ever found. The investigation revealed that Sarah had no history of mental health issues, no financial problems, no romantic complications, and no reason to disappear voluntarily. She was scheduled to graduate magna cum laude in 3 weeks, had been accepted to multiple prestigious graduate programs, and was excited about her future research prospects. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Weinstein, described her work as revolutionary and confirmed that she was on track to publish several papers based on her undergraduate research. There was simply no conventional explanation for why Sarah would choose to vanish. The most perplexing aspect of Sarah's disappearance was the state in which her materials were found in the library. Her notebooks were arranged in a precise geometric pattern on the reading table, forming what looked like a complex mandala or mathematical diagram. Her laptop was open to a document that contained several pages of text written in what appeared to be her handwriting, but in a language that linguists consulted by the FBI couldn't identify. Most mysteriously, the special book that Jennifer had mentioned, the volume from Harvard's rare collection that Sarah had been studying, was missing from the library's collection entirely, with no record of it ever having been checked out or removed. Dr. Weinstein spent weeks analyzing Sarah's research notes and the equipment she had been using in her consciousness experiments, hoping to find some clue about what might have happened to her. He discovered that Sarah's most recent experiments had focused on what she called quantum narrative bridges, theoretical pathways that might allow consciousness to move between different versions of reality by following the mathematical patterns that underlie storytelling. Her notes suggested she believed she had identified specific conditions under which these bridges might become accessible to human consciousness. Professor Hartwell conducted her own investigation into the literary aspects of Sarah's research, focusing particularly on the texts Sarah had been studying in the weeks before her disappearance. She found that Sarah had been concentrating on stories and novels that dealt with parallel realities, time travel, and alternate histories, but approaching them not as fiction, but as potential maps of accessible alternate realities. Sarah's literary analysis had identified recurring patterns in these narratives that she believed might represent actual pathways between different versions of the world. As months turned to years, Sarah's disappearance became part of Harvard's institutional memory. The Sarah Chen Fellowship was established to support interdisciplinary research that bridged science and humanities, and her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing too far into unexplored intellectual territory. Her parents never stopped hoping for answers, returning to Boston every year on the anniversary of her disappearance to meet with investigators and maintain public awareness of their daughter's case. The breakthrough that would change everything came on October 15, 2024, exactly 7 years and 5 months after Sarah's disappearance. Workers cleaning out abandoned storage units in South Boston as part of an urban renewal project discovered a unit that contained a single item, a briefcase containing what appeared to be a completed doctoral dissertation titled Quantum Consciousness and Parallel Narrative Realities, a Theoretical and Experimental Investigation by Sarah Elizabeth Chen. The document was over 400 pages long, meticulously researched and footnoted, and far exceeded anything that could reasonably be expected from an undergraduate thesis. The storage unit had been rented under Sarah's name just 1 week before her disappearance, but there was no record of her having visited it since then. The facility's security cameras from 2017 were no longer available, so there was no way to determine how or when the briefcase had been placed there. Most puzzling of all, the storage unit fees had been paid automatically through a bank account that had been opened in Sarah's name, but contained funds from an untraceable source. When the briefcase was examined by Dr. Weinstein and Professor Hartwell, both immediately recognized Sarah's distinctive writing style and theoretical approach, but the content went far beyond anything she had shared with them before her disappearance. The dissertation appeared to be a complete scientific and philosophical framework for understanding consciousness as a quantum phenomenon capable of existing across multiple parallel realities simultaneously. More remarkably, it included detailed experimental data and observations that could only have been gathered through years of sophisticated research using equipment that didn't exist in 2017. The most extraordinary section of the dissertation was titled Personal Experimental Log, 7 Years in Parallel Boston, 2017-2024. In this section, Sarah described her own experience of what she called consciousness migration, the process by which her awareness had somehow transferred from her original reality to a parallel version of the world that was similar but fundamentally different from the one she had left behind. According to her account, she had spent the 7 years since her disappearance living and working in an alternate version of Boston, where she had access to more advanced technology, and where her research into quantum consciousness was not only accepted but actively supported by institutions that didn't exist in our reality. Sarah's description of this parallel Boston was both fascinating and unsettling. She wrote about a version of Harvard University that had developed along different historical lines, where the boundaries between science and what we might call magic had never been rigidly established. In this reality, researchers had been studying consciousness as a quantum phenomenon for decades, and they had developed technologies that allowed for controlled exploration of parallel realities. Sarah described laboratories where consciousness could be measured and manipulated with the same precision that we apply to particle physics, and academic departments devoted to the study of what she called dimensional narrative theory. Most remarkably, Sarah's parallel world contained other individuals who had somehow crossed over from our reality, researchers, artists, and thinkers who had disappeared from our world under mysterious circumstances and had found themselves in this alternate Boston, where their most ambitious intellectual projects could be pursued without the limitations that constrained them in their original reality. Sarah described a community of dimensional refugees who had become the leading researchers and